My task over the next few minutes is to convince you why you should really care about damp, muddy places that are often completely full of mosquitoes. My name's Ben. I have a PhD in Public International Law and Oceans Governance, and I'm now a postdoctoral fellow supported by AXA at University College London. And as this image suggests, the focus of my research over the next few years is marine and coastal ecosystems. What do I mean by that term? Well, I'm really talking about three different things. I'm talking about mangrove forests. This is a lovely example from the Dominican Republic. I'm talking about seagrass meadows and also some of their friendly inhabitants like the dugong you can see in this picture. This is from the United States. And then closer to home, the final main category of habitat is salt marshes. And this is an example from northern France that some of you might be familiar with. So that's the ecosystems I'm talking about. Why should we care about them? Well, I've got four reasons for today's purposes, and the four are, number one, they are one of the best ways of protecting our cities and our communities from floods and storm damage, and also from sea level rise. That's number one. Number two is they're incredibly significant for improving salt water quality around the world. That's the quality of water in your beaches and the quality of water ingested by all of the seafood that you eat. Speaking of seafood, it takes me to number three, which is that mangroves in particular are spawning grounds for fish that are the sole source of dietary protein for literally hundreds of millions of people around the world. And finally, and this is drawing on some very recent scientific work starting in around 2009, we're increasingly realizing that marine and coastal ecosystems are very significant from the perspective of climate change mitigation. So they actually absorb the same amount of carbon as all vegetation on land combined. So we always hear about tropical rainforests being the lungs of the world. Actually, that's just one lung. The other lung is the kinds of ecosystems that I'm focusing my work on. So, as I've outlined, these ecosystems are all incredibly valuable. The key question is, what are we actually doing with them? And the answer is not very positive. They're actually being degraded and destroyed faster than almost any other habitat on Earth. Fortunately, in the case of a lot of terrestrial vegetation like rainforests, there's been large movements to improve our management. That hasn't really happened yet with mangrove salt marshes and seagrass beds. Mangroves are being destroyed in the order of 8% of acreage per year, and compare that with around 1 or 2% for vegetation on land in the form of forests. And so what are the main drivers of this degradation? Well, this is a good illustration of the immense pressures of coastal development all around the world, in developed countries, in developing countries. Another significant one, which you may not realize, and I hope it doesn't put you off your shrimp during lunch if there is any, is that to satisfy very strong demand for shrimp, a lot of these ecosystems are being cut down and replaced with shrimp ponds. And I heard a disturbing statistic the other day that the carbon footprint for one shrimp cocktail is roughly equivalent to driving from London to Edinburgh and back. So that's something to keep in mind. Another important question is, well, why is this happening? And from my perspective, it's happening because all of the important values that I've outlined are external to our economic systems, and they're external to our political systems. We really haven't come up with policy and legal measures to integrate all of these values into our decision making, whether it's decision making by governments or communities, or also by commercial operators. If I own a piece of coastal habitat, it's worth much more money to me to cut down the vegetation and build condominiums on it rather than actually preserve that value. So the externality of this natural capital is the main reason why it's being degraded at the rate that it is. So that's the context to the problem. Where does my research fit in? Well, I'm really looking at the examples around the world that are starting to spring up of removing this externality and actually taking into account the values of these ecosystems, both in policy frameworks, in commercial decision making, and also in the legal systems that inform all of those activities. And this is a good example from coastal India, nearby a village that was destroyed by a tropical cyclone. And this is a community-driven mangrove restoration project, and there are examples of these projects springing up all around the world, and indeed some of them are financed by carbon credits there's actually efforts to account for the amount of CO2 in these sinks. These kinds of projects and investment in this natural capital is also potentially a significant opportunity for commercial actors who have large liability in relation to the damage associated with the degradation of these ecosystems, so storm damage, sea level rise. Investing strategically in these ecosystems, whether you're a company or a government or a community, is potentially a very effective way of improving the situation. But unfortunately, what's standing in the way of all this investment is we just don't have the right policy tools and the right knowledge to create a climate for this investment. And that's exactly what I'm doing. We don't have the toolbox of policy measures, so I'm going to spend the next 2 years looking around the world, trying to find examples of what works, what doesn't work, and looking at that systematically, and I'll be building that toolbox, and stay tuned for the results.
Thank you.